afternoon. Dr. Ronald del Castillo. I am Filipino-American. I remember the first time someone else reminded me that I was Filipino. I was in third grade in St. Bernard Elementary School in a suburb in LA. And not long before that particular moment, we had just moved to California from Iloilo. Many of our mothers, my mother was a nurse. She's now in a well-deserved retirement. Overseas Philippines, first 10 years of life. She was emblematic of that Filipino who gives up so much for her family. So fast forward to 1991, 2 weeks after I had just turned 10, we moved to LA. In that particular moment at St. Bernard, my classmates and I had just sat down for lunch. And there I was, I pulled out my steamed white rice and fish wrapped in foil. And the reaction was instantaneous. Some laughed, pointing fingers with one hand, whilst holding their Lunchables and sandwiches in the other. You could clearly hear the ew, like, what's that? Some of my Filipino classmates, and there were many Filipinos in that neighborhood and so forth, therefore in that school, looked at me with anger and resentment, as if I betrayed and misrepresented our shared culture, right? As if I've blown the cover of what they really eat when they go home at the end of the day. Now, that moment was embarrassing, to be sure, but more than anything else, it felt lonely and rejecting. The subtext of that moment is, you're not like us. Now, I cannot say that after that particular moment, I made the deliberate choice to be more like them. But I guess if I pause and give it the space to run the treadmill of my memories, the years that followed after that moment at lunch in elementary school were years of remolding my cultural identity to be more American. I mean, I had the advantage of age. Yes, I was old enough to remember my life in Iloilo. I remember the rice fields behind our house. I remember the pigs and chickens. I remember that we had a monkey. I remember the loving and amazing extended family, many of them, and the warmth of my lolo's house during the weekend when we would visit and hang out with my many cousins. But I was also young enough where the change to being more American was made easier. I was only 10. So it made it easier to refine my American English. And by that, I mean easier to get rid of my Filipino accent. It was a negative correlation. The less I had the accent, the more I was assimilated. And this was not, a small matter, because it meant I'm more like them. I played into the idea of the model minority, not as if it was a myth, but as if it was a mantra. The idea of Asian Americans as well-educated, career-driven, good, successful people. And I mean, I didn't really know what that was at the time, but I look back and realize, yep, that was me on the model minority train. In 8th grade, I graduated at the top of my class. I was the captain of my volleyball team. I went to an all-boy Jesuit high school. I remember in college, distinctly, going to the laundry room, and in the hallway, I was stopped by my friends on their way out. It was Friday night, and they asked me to join, and I distinctly remember I said no because it was Friday, and Friday night was laundry night. There I was, 18 or 19 years old, in New York, living in a dorm 2 blocks from Central Park and walking distance from Midtown Manhattan, saying no to going out because it was my laundry night. I was determined not to fail as Filipino. So the model minority was not going to be a myth for me. So fast forward to 2016, I was sitting in a working group meeting for the mental health law here in the Philippines. The meeting was, with advocates, mental health professionals, clinicians, academics, researchers, many who spent much of their professional career really developing this mental health law. At the time, I was an associate professor at the College of Public Health at UP Manila. I was invited to help craft the mental health legislation, what it could look like. And I relished in that opportunity. A little more than a year earlier, I came back from the US. I took the leap to return to my home. I thought that I could be more helpful, more useful here. And I relished in it, in that opportunity in the working group meeting in 2016. I came back from the US with a doctorate in clinical psychology and a master's in public health, specifically in health policy. And I was excited and really grateful to be part of that working group. During the meeting, one of the academics, who's also a clinician, not so implicitly suggested that my views and inputs do not reflect the lived experience of Filipinos here. I did not grow up here. Most of my education and training were in the US. And after all, I had only returned a little more than a year earlier, right? So all of that is true. And others in the room in that meeting seemed to quietly agree. Heck, I agreed. My lens was filtered through my experience not as Filipino, but as Filipino-American. But that moment in the working group meeting for me also meant one other thing. You're not like us. It was lunchtime in 3rd grade all over again. And that moment was not an isolated incident. In the past 6 years of living here in the Philippines, there have been direct and indirect micro insults to my Filipino-American identity. Behaviors, opinions, feelings, or thoughts that others seem to easily attribute to one thing. I'm either too American or not Filipino enough. Now, to be fair, I take some responsibility. Maybe I shouldn't speak up so much during department meetings. I shouldn't disagree so much with more senior colleagues and practice more, that deference to authority, which seems I should keep my opinion to preserve group cohesion. Yes, I probably take more deliberate steps to be more fluent in the local language. It is me who needs to adjust, and that I will never get it until I do. But here's the thing. I will never get it. I will never be Filipino enough. I will always be too American. That's what 24 years of being American has taught me, because there I was never American enough. I live in 2 worlds that will probably never come together in a satisfying, cohesive, conclusive identity. And I love it. I have a choice here. I could continuously be disappointed at never fitting in, or I could value that I might never will. And I choose the latter. In the last 2 years in particular, I gave up that felt responsibility that I should fit in. For all the opportunities and privilege of living up to the model minority mantra, it was not easy. Those 24 years in the US, the psychological and emotional burden of living up to this so-called American dream, the psychological and emotional burden that my mother's and father's hard work was not for nothing. That was exhausting. And I vow not to repeat that burden here. Yes, I think differently because I'm Filipino-American. Yes, my perspectives are slightly different because I grew up in California and went to school in New York, San Francisco, Boston. And yes, here in the Philippines, my English has an accent, apparently. But wow, what a thrilling opportunity to have that different perspective. And yes, my views might not quite fit the lived experience of Filipinos who live here in the Philippines. Yes, I will probably get things wrong. I will probably never fully get kapwa or utang ng loob. Yes, surely my opinion is limited or skewed precisely because I left in 1991 and did not come back until about 25 years later, 25 years of erasing bits and pieces of my heritage that only now I'm trying to put back together. But wow, to me, what a valuable opportunity to embrace those mistakes and those limitations. For certain, the negative or difficult feelings are still there. There are still times in technical or working group meetings where I feel isolated or misunderstood. There are still times in department meetings where I do feel that I'm not part of the group, and how that makes me feel lonely. And there are times in my day-to-day interactions, at the bank, at the grocery store, or wherever, where I feel embarrassed because I didn't fully understand the Filipino that he or she was saying. But instead of crawling into a shell, I embrace these negative or difficult feelings as a chance for me to cultivate my emotional growth. These experiences, some negative as they are, offer me a chance to ask, why am I feeling that way? Why am I reacting that way? They continuously help me face the good and the not so good part of who I am. In that isolation, in that rejection, I am not easily distracted by being alone. If anything, it's a chance for me to meaningfully reflect about my life. Being Filipino and being American, living in those two worlds, make me less afraid to be alone with my own feelings and my own thoughts. And that's cool stuff for me. For me, it feeds into my personal and professional life. Surely engaging in open, supportive conversations with people we trust about our inner world must be a good thing for our mental health and well-being. And for my career, these two worlds excite me. I want to write about my immigration experience. I wish to write an essay or even a book about my experience as someone who lived here, moved there, came back. I feel that I can talk about race, about gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, colonization, imperialism, public health, mental health, in ways that are not necessarily conclusive or substantive, but in ways that are eager to learn and excited to ask questions. And with that, I feel that I'm able to articulate an inner world that is distinctive, that is different, not better, different. And that is another lesson for me of being too American and not Filipino enough. To this day, but especially in the first year or so when I came back, one of the first things I'm often asked is, why did you come back? But there's usually a tone of judgment rather than curiosity. Like, why did you come back? The implication being, it is better over there. And I get that. I suspect it's why my parents wanted to move my family to California. But the risk in believing in better is the danger of engaging in the rejecting and degrading, "You're not like us." That's another beauty for me of living in two worlds, the skill of cultivating and celebrating differences rather than rejecting them. For someone who's experienced being labeled different, or I have plentiful chances and opportunities to draw from with which to be more empathetic, who might have experienced otherness as well. I can share with you these kinds of things from a place of privilege, and I get that. I am privileged. There's no two ways about that. But living in two worlds allows me to decipher and be curious about that privilege beyond material privilege. It's not just about the privilege of having lived in the US, going to the schools, being in the profession that I'm in, and the material things these offer me. I am able to see the privilege distinct perhaps from how others see them, because I know that that privilege was not handed on a silver platter. The privilege was born out of a mother who worked two jobs throughout her career in California. The privilege was born out of a father who worked in convenience stores, who sold newspapers, even though we left Iloilo where he was a professional. The privilege was born out of the reality that for the first 10 years of my life, I barely saw my mother. Living in two worlds means I get to incisively look at my own privilege, question it more deeply, and honor it with both negative and positive weights. I suspect some of you, perhaps many of you here, feel that you are too much of something or not enough of something else. You have a choice. It can be this cloud of disappointment, always wishing to be like them, or it can be a chance to value your own distinctive self-worth. I hope you choose the latter. Thank you very much.